ISO Productions presents another instructional video tutorial from ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello and welcome to yet another FileMaker tutorial video from FileMakerMagazine.com. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these FileMaker tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. And in this tutorial video, we are taking a look at using gradients, going native with FileMaker 12. Now, the reason that I'm making this video is because I had released a product called Gradient Maker, which prior to FileMaker 12 would create gradients, but it would create these gradients in what's known as a rasterized format. That's something that you would say, for example, put out of Photoshop, or something that was not vector-based. What we're talking about are the gradients that are native in FileMaker 12. So let's switch over to FileMaker 12, and we're going to work with the gradient tool. Now, the first thing that I want to tell you is the reason that you want to use native gradients is because in order to render these, FileMaker is using math and is able to do them internally in a much faster way than if it actually has to gather all of the information that's contained within a rasterized, which is a fixed size graphic of simply just a drawing of a gradient, and each one of those pixels within that gradient has a value. So in FileMaker 12 and forward, you want to use the native gradients as much as possible, if not exclusively. There are very, very few situations that I've come across the need to use any rasterized gradients in any of the FileMaker 12 solutions that I have created, or the FileMaker 12 theme. So let's head into this. With a standard square, what we're going to have advantage, or going to have access to here is simply everything that we have access to in the Appearance Inspector. But the problem with a square is that the square doesn't have as many features, or the rectangle doesn't have as many features as we have, say, for example, in a piece of text. So if I simply type out some text here, and then scale this out, let's say to the exact same size of the box. Let's make these exact same size. So this text in particular does not have to contain anything that is visible. Let's just hit a space, for example. Same box, same size, same dimensions. Let's also try a button. So let's say that the button is going to either do nothing, or let's just say it's going to set a variable, but that variable is nothing, and we click OK. And we go ahead and we set this. Now, FileMaker's default theme is going to have a different look and feel for all of these different objects, for the rectangle, for the text box, and then the button. But of course, we could make all of these look exactly the same. We could set all of them to have a solid color of white and to have a corner radius of 0. And then also have a line of whatever. So let's set this line to solid, and let's set it to 1 point, and let's set it to a color of gray. So there we go. All of our objects look exactly the same. Now, deceiving as this is, what we do notice is that when we select here and we right-click, we do not have what we do have right here, which is obviously conditional formatting. Now, when it comes to the conditional formatting that we do have access to on a text box, it's not as extensive as what we have here on a button. So you can see that yet here we have not only conditional formatting, but we have the button setup and the set script triggers. Now, of all of these objects, the button is going to have the most possible features to it. Yet, all of these are just objects. So when it comes to designing your FileMaker layout, you can, for example, simply use a button just for the purpose of being able to display on-screen text just as much as you can the text object. Now, it doesn't make sense logically why you might want to do that, but knowing that you have additional features and that just because you don't make a button means that you can basically use it as is. Now, sometimes a user is obviously potentially going to click on an object, and this, when you click on it, does have the states that a piece of text does not. For example, the hover and the pressed. which the hover will apply to the text object, but the pressed does not because it's not a button. So I just wanted to point that out to know that there are times where when I just need a simple gradient, because I want to use conditional formatting in order to make that gradient go away or do something else or show a solid color, whatever it is, I will use a text object instead of an actual rectangle. So my interfaces tend to be composed more of your buttons and your text objects than they do regular rectangles. But I do still use regular rectangles. So I'm going to get rid of this rectangle. And we're going to use this text block, and we're going to go through some of the ways that you can format a gradient. Now, there's a bunch of different things that you can do with gradients in terms of really enhancing your solution. Gradients are the spice to life. They give your solution or your user interface the depth that it needs. Of course, we can do the solid color, but we go to gradient, and FileMaker is going to default. Now, when it comes to gradients, these little sliders can go wherever you want them to go. In fact, one of the easiest things to do, which was popular and is now falling out of popularity because of the whole flat design becoming popular, was basically the highlight or the gloss that you see on a lot of Apple's buttons. That, as opposed to adding more points in between, was simply a matter of just dragging these two into each other in order to make a hard edge. So what you're able to do is I can click on this particular color right here, the second of the two that came from this edge. I can use the little magnifying glass and I can actually select the color that is the color up on top. I can do that here on the layout, or I can do it right here within the color palette. I can even do it within this actual little drag point, which actually has the color represented inside of it. So by clicking here, what I can now do is I can actually adjust this gradient because I have the two stops, hopefully both within the middle, both of them right close up to each other. But by varying this just a few degrees, a few subtle degrees, you're going to see that I'm going to be able to create that gloss effect. Now all I have to do is simply add a few more points if I wanted to enhance this. Now the total number of points that I believe you get across a whole gradient is 5 total stops. You can have 1, 2, and then only 3 in between. So we can do that by clicking 1, or our 3rd, our 4th, and now our 5th. And if we try to click again, you can see that we cannot add a 6th item. So if I was to enhance this gradient, and you simply drag these off and as basically terribles. If I drag this down, it'll disappear. If I click in the middle, it'll add one. So if I drag this all the way to the end, and you can see right there when it goes to that color, what I've noticed is here's a little bit of a trick. If we add this, and if I drag, and you can see it becomes a little bit more translucent, if I continue with that drag in that direction, it will disappear. If I drag to the end and I hit the translucent, but then I drag just slightly, just a few little pixels over to the opposite direction, it will retain that, hopefully keeping this set at 100%. Now what I'm able to do is I'm able to click on the magnifying glass, get the color that we dragged into, and then make this one just a little bit darker right there. And I could do the same over here on this side, drag to the end, drag just a little bit more, keep it. And in this case, because my color is actually obscured or hidden, what I could do is drag this off temporarily, grab this little lookup, grab that same color, go ahead and close that out, drag these back on top of each other so that they're creating the hard line, and then click this again, and then raise up my hue just a little bit, just a touch. When we're dealing with gradients, we're only talking about subtle differences. 2 to 3% can easily be seen and perceived by the eye, and that's all that we really need to do. So we can see that what we've done here is we've created this gloss effect. But of course, even without these on the edge, we still have more of a flat gloss effect, but it's a really great way to treat this particular gradient. Now let's duplicate this, and let's go ahead and create our normal standard gradient, which is all the way at the edge, all the way at the edge, and this one, there we go, got that all the way to the edge now. So basically, you're probably familiar that you can do any two colors that you want in order to create these. Now let's work with one of our most common situations, which is creating a drop shadow effect. Let's say, for example, let's move that one down and move this one all the way to the top and all the way across. Let's say that I wanted to create a shadow across this. First thing I'm going to do is take off the line, make sure I don't have any line that's going to show. But I'm going to size this relative to the size of the gradient that I want to make. Now, I don't have to do this, but it just makes it a little bit easier to manage. Now, sometimes it does warrant having a much longer one, knowing that maybe you say, for example, you have a label that's laying on top of this, and you want to be able to select the gradient underneath. Well, because we can't click through objects in FileMaker, in fact, let's actually go ahead and do this. Let's add some text here. Some text. And then we'll go ahead and center that. Let's go to our paragraph settings and center that text and scroll this up and then put it above there. And we will assume that this also is a no fill object so that we have some text above. Now, what I'm pointing out is that if this gradient behind this object is something that I want for the background, where I'm going to show a reverse or a shadow effect, because I click here, I'm not able to click that gradient. Of course, I could make this smaller right there, but there are reasons that I leave it that length. By having this much longer, it makes it so that I can actually select it, obviously, underneath. So the way that a shadow works is it's really simple. You probably already know that you could, say, for example, go really dark here, and then instead of adding another point, you could drag this all the way up and simply make this the same color as the background, reducing the overall number of points. Remember, in FileMaker, everything counts. Everything. All points in a gradient, all the total number of objects on your layout, however many pieces of text you have, it all matters. So what we're going to do with this particular gradient is we can obviously vary this. But the way that a shadow gradient works is that a shadow sometimes is heavier at the point where the shadow starts, but then drops off or fades really quickly. So we are going to add another point here in between. We're going to borrow the color that we had right here, and we're going to lighten this up pretty significantly so that our gradient closest up to the top is going to be really strong, but then our transition period, you can see that the distance between these two is going to be really short, but then the distance between these two is almost going to be double whatever we had at the beginning. That's going to give us what I call an accelerated gradient, where we're accelerating the amount, or we're compressing, I guess you could say also, the amount of darkness that's within this gradient. Now, this is all great and fine, having done this with these regular gray colors, but it's not very effective or very efficient. Here's my case in point. If this background of my whole layout, let's say, for example, was a shade of purple, what happens to my gradient? I have lost all of my flexibility in terms of being able to change things behind, because this is using fixed colors of grays. What you almost always want to do when you're dealing with shadows is you want to deal within translucency. So if it's a highlight that you want to apply, you're going to have translucent white. If it's a shadow that you want to apply, you're going to have translucent black. So this is very easy to solve. What we're going to do is every one of these three colors is going to become black, but it's going to become a percentage of black. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this first one, set the brightness to black, and then we're going to go and we're going to enter 30%. And we're going to tab. We're going to do the same thing here with this one. We're going to drop it all the way to black, and on this one we're going to put 15. And we're going to tab. And on the last one, we're going to click and we're going to also make it black, but we're going to set an opacity of 0. So by working with translucency on a black or white value in order to create a highlight or a shadow, you can see that what happens is anything underneath now becomes an attribute of the gradient that is above it. And this is how I do almost everything. You can see that by dragging the box larger or smaller, I'm able to increase or reduce, or increase or decrease the size of my actual gradient. But in no way does it affect what's going on underneath. I can change this background to pretty much any color, and that gradient or the shadow still applies. So this is what you want to do. You want to treat all of your objects in terms of the color that you want the object to be. If you want the object to be gray, then you can go ahead and use gray gradient colors. If the object is going to be, for example, green, and you want to put a highlight on it, and you want to be able to use conditional formatting, then you're going to put a highlight on top of that button. Let's do that quickly. We'll make a button really quick. We'll just simply say set variable, and we'll call it button. And then we will make this the green that we want it to be. In fact, let's go ahead and make it a solid color of the green that we want. Now, one thing I want to point out is the reason that I am in this mode right here, this hue, saturation, brightness. This is the easiest way in order to pick colors. If you are used to picking colors in RGB, forget it. The human eye cannot pick out how much of a green do I need and how much of a blue do I need in order to get the magenta or the orange that I'm looking for. Absolutely ridiculous. The only time that you want to use RGB is if you're using some type of on-screen color picker tool. For example, digital color meter here in the Macintosh allows you to pass over things within your interface and look at these RGB values. But even then, you don't have to display those values in RGB. You can go up to View, and you can actually change the display values to hexadecimal, which is used on the web, or even as percentage, which is what's used internally within FileMaker's CSS in order to render things on the layout. So that's the only time you need to use RGB. Any other time that you're using color, you're not going to use CMYK because we're doing nothing to do with print. You're almost always going to be on HSB. You can see that right here. Low saturation means you're going to be in your grays. High saturation means you're going to be in your most vibrant situation for colors. Hue simply is your color slider right there. What color do you want? And once you pick that color, which we want a green, then how dark do you want it? Do you want it to be pretty dark? And how much of a grayish hue do you want it to have? Do you want it to be more neutral in between, or do you want it to be really colorful over here all the way at 100% on your saturation? Totally up to you. So now that we've got this button can take advantage of conditional formatting. So the conditional formatting could be something like if false, then turn red. But we still want to be able to use gradient. So here's where we have to get into FileMaker's layering. So using this same text object, what we can do is we can drag all of our objects or our color points out. We can select, and we're now going to, instead of black, we're going to use white. Now, saturation is always going to be all the way over to the left, and you're either going to be using a solid black or a solid white, and then you're going to be using opacity, or the opacity, however you want to pronounce that, in order to control the percentage. So here, you're typically going to use more or less the inverse of what you do on blacks. When you're doing shadows and blacks, it's usually in a 30-40% range, and on highlights, you're going to do the opposite of that, a 60-70. So if we put in, say, for example, a 60% white, and it doesn't have to be precise. I always find myself dragging to precise values. 62, hey, it's fine. And if we put over here our value of white again, but we go 100%, or excuse me, 0%, you can see that what we're getting is that nice highlight. Now, as I place this object over this one and resize them up and realign them, did that all with my nice little magic keys. I would also need to clear up the little edges that we see right there, and I could fix those, of course. But what I get is I get the effect that I'm looking for, knowing that when conditional formatting takes over underneath, if it goes red, I still retain my highlight above this button. Now, of course, the highlight is being applied to the text as well. So if you wanted to move the button label text from the button to the text object above, of course, you can do that. All right, so having changed some colors around and moved some things, there's one last thing that I'm going to talk about with regards to gradients. Now, as I duplicate my gradient here, the white highlight that I created, the one gradient that a lot of times you don't necessarily know what to do with unless you have played with it a lot is the radial gradient. So as I reset this gradient, which I'll do by simply going to solid color and then going back to gradient, which will reset it to whatever the default is for that particular object. In this case, I believe it's a text object. Yep, it is. The radial gradient gives us the ability to do some really nice things. Now, let's say, for example, that this was a button, and we wanted this button to be a nice rounded button with a nice highlight to it. We can accomplish this with the radial gradient, as well as accomplishing things such as highlights and shadows in certain ways. It all has to do with these two values right here, or these two little control handles, the square and the circle, the center point and then the full radius, I believe. And that's going to control our arc because we are able to have these outside of the actual object. So as I turn this into a radial gradient, and I make this more obvious, this is something that you can do. In order to adjust your gradient, make things temporarily as obvious as they need to be. Then go ahead and readjust your gradient after you've done that. So for example, here where I have my center point represented by the circle, you can see that as I stretch this, look at what's happening. Here when I'm straight up and down from the actual outer circumference part, I get this perfect circle. But watch what happens as I drag this to the side. What happens to my circle? You can see that the circle becomes a little bit more of an ovoid. So knowing this, you can use these controls and acquire a lot of different effects. Let's take, for example, a highlight from the bottom. If I was to drag this handle up, and if I wanted this to basically cover the distance of this whole button, what I'm going to be doing is I'm simply going to be using the center point there, but then I'm going to be moving things out as we go right here. Now, if this is too strong, there are two ways that I can control what's going on here. One, I could drop this straight down in order to reduce the intensity of my center point. The other one is I could simply reduce the value of the color that's within there in order to reduce that intensity right there. Now, by adding different color points, that's when we're able to get all of the different effects that we want to get. For example, if I add a color point right here and I make this color point roughly the same as what I have right here, and then I add a color point and I make this color point the same as what we have right here, the same thing that we saw initially where we were creating that gloss effect button applies to radial gradients as well. It's just that the arc doesn't cut off necessarily that well. You can see that you get these jaggies, but you have just as much control in order to make a hard edge or a soft edge circle as you do with a gradient. And it all depends on how much color you have in between. So, having talked about a rounded button, I want you to know that you can make buttons that give you the effects of things that you're looking for. I believe this is a button object. Yep, it is a button. So let's duplicate this button object, and let's say that the button object we're working with is going to be an object that is, say, 20 by 20. That's a very nice, easy object. This button can go in, and half of 20 is going to be 10. So at the midpoint, 10 pixels and 10 pixels equaling 20 is going to turn this into a circle. Selecting my text character, let's say I'm going to go in and put a plus sign just for grins. And that messed up my object size because it made it a little bit larger. Let's see if it'll take the 20. And it will take the 20. Obviously, this isn't the most ideal in terms of a plus sign. And in most cases, my solution to this is to add an image that's going to be higher in resolution so that when it's displayed on a higher pixel density display, such as a iPad with Retina, it will actually render well. But for the purposes of being able to show this little plus, we're essentially creating the little Apple Plus button that allows you to do things. So what I'm able to do is I'm able to set this as a gradient, make sure it's a radial gradient, go ahead and get my colors. I'm going to jack up my saturation, get my nice hue, my nice red color, bring this darkness down a little bit. I'm going to go over to my other color. I'm going to use my eyedropper and grab that color up, or if I'm on Windows, I'm going to use a color picker tool, get those values, and then put them in. So now with this, I know that I can actually add a color right here in the middle and another color right there. I can change those colors to the same color. And you don't have to actually close the colors palette in order to click on each of these little color stops. What I'm able to do is I'm able to adjust this now just ever so slightly by giving it a little bit more of a gray to it. Change this one to get the color that I changed it to, knowing that I can click and bring these together. For the arc, I can now zoom in, and it looks like, depending on the direction of the arc that you want, you're going to have to flip things up. And it looks like I needed to actually do this in the inverse order, but I think you get the idea. The darker one more or less needed to be on the bottom. But by moving this into the middle and moving this one over here, I can now accomplish, by dragging this center point wherever it needs to be and dragging this one right here, I can accomplish the arc that I'm actually looking for that might give a rounded look in terms of a highlight or a gloss that you would find on a round style of button. So even though I'm going to have to leave that ugly as it may be, obviously zooming in to 100% when you're working with your gradients is very helpful. I can see zoomed out here at 100%. This is not the most ideal. I'm getting some jaggies. That's where you go in and you actually modify things. You tweak them and drag them around until they do what you want them to do in order to get the arc that you're actually looking for and the type of blend and gradient that you're looking for in order to make that a nice softer look. It's all about touch and feel and tweaking until you get the look that you're looking for. The big key ingredient here is that this is a native mathematically generated gradient. It's much faster, FileMaker handles it, and it zooms as well. It's not a static rasterized gradient that as soon as you zoom in becomes a pixelated image and also adds a lot more weight to your database than this particular native gradient. So I hope throughout the course of this video you've gotten a much better understanding of what you can do, especially with gradients within FileMaker 12. As always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own database development, and until next time, happy file making. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.